Welcome to Nightfall Tales. Take a slow, gentle breath in and softly let it go. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Gently close your eyes and let your body relax. As you unwind, I'd love to know where you're listening from, your city or country. Down in the comments. It's so comforting to feel this quiet. Let my voice carry you softly to a place where imagination wanders and calm dreams begin. Continue. The attic of the old house was a cathedral, and Elara had always known it to be so. Not a cathedral of stone and cold incense and voices raised in practiced harmony, but a cathedral of the other kind, the kind built slowly over generations by the accretion of kept things and the silence that gathers around them. The beams were its arches. The single dormer window was its rose window, and the pale January light that came through it this afternoon was the colour of old ivory, or of a candle seen through water, or of the sky just before it decides to snow. It came in at a low angle and illuminated nothing directly, but gave everything in its reach a kind of equal, patient attention. The trunks with their brass latches gone green, the stacked boxes tied with lengths of faded ribbon, the bentwood chair with the broken cane seat that had been mended once and then broken again and never mended after that. All of it held in that soft, undiscriminating light like objects in a painting of a painting. The dust motes drifted in the still light. Elara stood just inside the low door at the top of the attic stairs, her hand still on the door frame, and let the cold of the place settle around her. It was a particular cold, not the sharp cold of outdoors, not the damp cold of a cellar, but the still cold of a space that had been sealed from the ordinary business of heating and cooling for a very long time, a cold that had become a kind of atmosphere, a climate of its own, as though the attic existed in a slightly different season than the house below. She had her wool cardigan on, the grey one with the wooden buttons, and she pulled it closer now without thinking. The floorboards beneath her feet were the same pine as the rest of the house, but up here they had never been covered with carpet or worn smooth by daily passage, and they held their grain with a kind of dignity, each plank still distinctly itself, still remembering the tree it had been. She had put this off for 3 years. 3 years since her mother had died in the front bedroom downstairs, in the bed where she had been born, in the house where 4 generations of women before her had also been born and died, and where Elara herself had been born, and where she understood, with the quiet certainty of a woman who has learned not to resist what is true, she too would one day die. The attic had held their things, and for 3 years Elara had climbed these stairs only to stand at the door, as she was standing now, and look into the cold and the quiet and the slow drifting light, and feel the task as too large, too much, too close still to the raw place where grief had been. But today she had come with her canvas bag and her box for the things to give away, and her steadier heart, and she meant to begin. The trunks held their old silences, She moved among them slowly, one hand occasionally reaching out to touch a surface. The rounded lid of the oldest trunk, black with age and reinforced with iron strips that had rusted to a reddish brown. The side of a cardboard box with her aunt's handwriting on it in faded pencil. Bedroom upstairs, 1962, the edge of a hat box, its striped paper gone soft as cloth with the years. Her footsteps were careful and quiet on the boards. She was a tall woman. Elara still straight in her 80s. With white hair she wore pinned and hands that had always done what was asked of them without complaint. Hands that had kneaded bread and turned the pages of the family Bible and planted bulbs in the autumn garden and held her mother's hand in that last quietening. She did not hurry. She had learned over many decades that the things worth doing were worth doing at the pace they required, and that the attic would not rush for anyone. She touched a christening gown folded inside a hat box she lifted the lid from, and she paused. The gown was made of a fine yellowed cotton, its hem trimmed with lace that had gone the colour of old cream, its tiny buttons still fastened at the back with the care of someone who had put it away expecting to see it again. She lifted it gently, barely, just enough to feel the cloth, which was so fine and so old that it seemed to weigh almost nothing, seemed barely there between her fingers. She did not know whose it was. Her own, perhaps, or her mother's, or her mother's mother's. The christening gowns of this family had a way of reappearing at each generation's beginning, and she had been told once that this gown was very old indeed. Though she could no longer remember who had told her, she laid it back in the hat box with the same care with which it had been placed there, and she replaced the lid, and she set it in the corner she was designating as the corner for keeping. The dust motes drifted in the still light. She found baby shoes in a tin, 2 pairs, both impossibly small, one of white leather and one of a soft brown suede worn to velvet at the toes. She found a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, so faded she could not determine what colour it had originally been, addressed in a hand she did not recognize to an address in a city she had never associated with any member of her family. She found a set of bone-handled fish knives in a leather case, which she set in the box for giving away. Having no use for fish knives, and no one left in the family to pass them down to, she was, as she had been for some years now, the last of her line, the last woman in a house that had always held women, the end of a chain of keeping and tending that had stretched unbroken from the first woman who had walked these rooms to the woman who now walked them and who would be the last. She did not find this sad. Exactly. It was what it was. The house would go to some other family eventually, and they would bring their own accumulations, their own things to keep, their own silences to store in the attic. The house would hold them as it had held her family. Houses do not belong to families. Families belong to houses for a time, and then the house belongs to the next ones. She had arrived at this understanding gradually over the long years of her tenancy here, and it had settled into her with the ease of a thing that is simply true. She worked through one box and then another. The pale winter light moved slowly across the attic floor, the shadow of the dormer window's frame shifting by degrees, so gradual they could only be noticed in retrospect. She would look down and see that the shadow had moved a hand's width and know that time had passed, though she had not felt it passing. Old linens, folded with the precision of someone who had believed in the importance of folding. Her mother, this must have been her mother's work, for her mother had folded everything with a carefulness that had always seemed to Elara both admirable and faintly sorrowful, as though each act of folding were a small, silent insistence on order in the face of a world that does not hold its folds. She unfolded and refolded several of the linens, setting the better ones in the keeping corner, and the worn ones, the ones with the thin patches and the small mended tears, in the box for giving away, where they might still serve some purpose in some other household. The house breathed its patient breath. The large trunk, the one that had sat in the corner closest to the dormer window, for as long as Elara could remember, the one with the domed lid and the tarnished brass latch and the faded floral paper lining that she had once, as a child, been told not to touch. This was the trunk she had been working toward without quite admitting to herself that she was working toward it. It was her mother's trunk, not the trunk of her mother's later life, not the one that had been in the bedroom and which Elara had sorted through in the first grief, heavy weeks after her mother's death, but the older one, the one her mother had brought to this house when she married, the one she had kept locked for decades, with a small brass key that had lived on a ribbon in her jewelry box, and that Elara now took from her cardigan pocket. The key was warm from her body. She held it for a moment, feeling its small weight. She knelt before the trunk, carefully, because her knees required carefulness now, and fitted the key into the lock. The lock turned with a resistance that was not mechanical difficulty, but simply the resistance of a thing that had been closed for a very long time. And then it gave, with a sound that was barely a sound at all, a small, soft click, and Elara lifted the lid. The smell of lavender came up to meet her first. Her mother had kept dried lavender everywhere, in the linen closet, in the drawer with her good handkerchiefs, tucked into the pockets of coats hanging in the wardrobe. The smell of it had been the smell of her mother in a way that was deeper than reason, a smell that went straight past thought and into somewhere older, and it rose now from the open trunk with such clarity that Elara was briefly not in the attic at all, but in her mother's bedroom on a summer afternoon, her mother sitting at the dressing table brushing her hair. She held herself still and let the moment pass through her, as such moments must be let to pass, and then she looked down into the trunk. The linens on top were the finest she had seen yet. A tablecloth of white damask, its folds so precise they must have been ironed in, a set of monogrammed napkins still in their original ribbon, several pillow slips with drawn threadwork, at the hems that must have taken someone hours, perhaps days, to complete. Elara lifted them out one by one and set them on the floor beside her, smoothing each one as she placed it down, feeling in the fine weave the attention of the hands that had made them, the patience of a kind of making that the world had largely ceased to practice. Beneath the linens were smaller things, a folded length of pale blue ribbon, a pair of white gloves with tiny pearl buttons at the wrist, a small prayer book with a cracked spine whose inscription on the flyleaf read, "To my dear girl, with all the love of your mother, on the occasion of your confirmation." The handwriting was her grandmother's. She recognized it from the birthday cards she had kept, and she set the prayer book in the keeping corner with a care that was also a kind of greeting. The dust motes drifted in the still light layer by layer. She worked her way down through the trunk, a folded piece of embroidery, half finished, the needle still threaded with pale rose silk, as though her mother had simply set it down for a moment and not yet come back to it, though she had set it down 50 years ago or more. A bundle of letters tied with a different ribbon, blue this one, and legible in its colour, which Elara recognized as being in her father's hand, written before their marriage, kept. She placed them in the keeping corner without reading them, because they were not hers to read. Some privacies outlast the people who kept them. The trunks held their old silences. She was near the bottom now. The lavender smell was stronger here, or perhaps she had simply grown accustomed to it, and it had deepened, as familiar smells do when you stop trying to notice them and simply breathe. She lifted a final layer of linen, a small quilt. This one, pieced from scraps of fabric that she thought she might recognize from old dresses, old shirts, old lives, cut into squares and sewn back together into something new. And beneath it, at the very bottom of the trunk, were two things: a photograph, and, tucked behind it, a folded piece of paper. She lifted the photograph first. It was small, smaller than the postcard she kept in the box on her writing desk, and sepia toned, the colours of old tea and old honey and the particular brown of things that have spent decades slowly becoming what age makes of them. It had been printed on a stiff card mount, the kind common at the end of the last century, and the beginning of this one with a small decorative border and the name of a photographic studio printed in fine script at the bottom edge. The studio name meant nothing to her. The town was one she knew only vaguely, a town in the north, a market town, a place she had never had occasion to go. She held the photograph in both hands and looked at it for a long time. There were two figures standing before a garden gate. The gate was wrought iron, decorative, set into a low stone wall, and behind it there was a garden that was visible only in suggestion, the blurred shapes of roses perhaps, or some other full summer flower, not quite in focus. The way background things in old photographs often seem to be caught in the act of becoming something other than what they are. In the foreground, to the right of the gate, stood a young woman in a white dress. The dress was high, collared and long-sleeved and fitted at the waist in the manner of its era. And the woman wore her dark hair up, and she was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile, more a stillness, a composure, a careful arrangement of the face that the era required of its photographed women, but which could not quite suppress what was underneath it, which was something like happiness, something like the suppressed edge of a feeling too large to be entirely contained by composure. Elara knew that face. She had known it all her life. She had seen it in the mirror, because all her life people had told her she had her mother's face, and she had always supposed this was true without having seen her mother young. And now she saw that it was true, that this face before her was the face she had grown up beside, and that it was also in some structural way her own face, the bones of it, the proportion of brow to eye to mouth, her mother, young, so young, younger than Elara, could quite account for, young in the way that people are young before anything has happened to them, before life has had its long years of working on them. She must have been, 20, perhaps 21, before her marriage, certainly, because Elara had seen her parents' wedding photograph and her mother in it, had already been someone different, someone who had already begun the long process of becoming the woman Elara had known. But it was the other figure who held her attention now. He stood to the left of the gate, or rather he stood slightly behind her mother and to the left, and he was not looking at the camera. He was half turned toward it, as though he had been in the act of turning away when the photographer had captured him, or perhaps in the act of turning toward her mother. It was impossible to say which. His face was thus shown in partial profile, and what could be seen of it was the face of a young man, not yet 30, she thought, though the photograph made certainty difficult, with a high forehead and dark hair, and something in the set of his jaw that suggested a person accustomed to keeping his own counsel. He was dressed well in the his hand, and this was the thing Elara kept returning to, the thing she could not look away from. His hand was reaching toward her mother's, not quite touching it. The fingers extended in a gesture that was either the beginning of a touch or the end of one, and the space between his hand and her mother's hand was so small that it seemed to vibrate with the weight of what it contained, or had contained, or was about to contain. He was not her father. Her father she would have recognized instantly, even young. Her father had been a broad-shouldered, red-haired man with a particular way of standing, weight slightly back, chin slightly up, that she would have known in any photograph at any age. This man was none of that. This man was a stranger, and had been a stranger, it seemed, all of Elara's life, kept in the very bottom of a trunk, beneath all the layers that a life accumulates, held there in the dark and the cedar and the lavender, waiting. The cedar box kept its fragrance. She did not put the photograph down. She held it, and she reached for the folded piece of paper behind it, and she unfolded it with fingers that were not quite steady, the paper soft and fragile with age, the folds having been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases had gone translucent. It was a small piece of notepaper, her mother's notepaper, cream, coloured with the small floral border at the top, that her mother had used for as long as Elara could remember, and on it was a single line of handwriting. The ink had faded to a pale brown, the colour of the photograph itself, as though even the words were aging toward sepia, toward that warm, distant tone of things that have lived long enough to have passed out of the realm of the immediate and into the realm of the remembered. But the handwriting was still legible, her mother's hand, neat and small and slightly slanted to the right, the hand she had used to write shopping lists and letters, and in the margins of the family Bible, the hand Elara had known as well as her own. For the one who will understand why I kept this, Elara read it once, and then she read it again, and then she sat back on her heels and let the attic be quiet around her, which it was perfectly willing to be, which it had been for decades, while it waited for someone to read these 7 words. The house breathed its patient breath. She thought about her mother for a long time, not about the woman in the photograph. That woman was new to her, an addition, a revelation, but about the woman she had known, the woman who had inhabited these rooms for all of Elara's life, and for many years before and after. Her mother, who had woken early and made bread on Thursdays, and kept the garden with a dedication that was close to devotion. Her mother, who had laughed at certain things, at birds, particularly at the behaviour of birds, which she found reliably amusing in a way that her family had never entirely understood, but had grown fond of, the way one grows fond of the particular humour of a person one loves. Her mother, who had read in the evenings, always the same chair, the lamp positioned just so, the book held at an angle that Elara had unconsciously adopted herself, and only realized this when she caught her own reflection once in the dark window glass. Her mother, who had been, in the common understanding of such things, a thoroughly knowable woman, a woman without evident mystery, a woman whose life had seemed to Elara in the way that the lives of parents always seem to their children, to have begun at the point where the child's memory begins, and to have contained nothing before it worth accounting for. And yet the dust motes drifted in the still light. She turned the photograph over in her hands. On the back, nothing, no inscription, no date, no studio stamp beyond the one on the front. Whoever had printed this had printed it plain, or whoever had kept it without notation, had trusted the image to hold what it held without the assistance of words. In this it had succeeded Elara. The image held everything and explained nothing, which was perhaps precisely correct. She thought about the garden gate in the photograph, and she thought about a thing she had noticed over the years, without ever articulating it to herself. A small thing, a detail that had never seemed to require explanation, and now, suddenly, seemed to be quietly and patiently full of it. Her mother, in the later years of her life, had sometimes stood at the garden gate in the evening, their own garden gate, the wooden one at the back of the house that gave onto the lane, and looked out at nothing in particular, or at nothing Elara had ever been able to identify. She had stood there with a stillness that was different from her ordinary stillness, with a quality of attention that seemed directed inward rather than out, or perhaps directed at something so far away that the outward gaze was only a direction, a pointing, rather than an actual seeing. Elara had seen her do this many times, and had never thought to ask about it, because it had seemed like the kind of thing that did not require asking, the kind of private moment that a person is entitled to, that a daughter is right to leave alone. She understood now that she had been right to leave it alone, and she understood now what she had been leaving alone. Her mother had a life before her father. Of course she had. Every person who has lived long enough to love has loved before, has had a before, has carried some before inside them for all the years of the after. This was not strange. This was not a secret in the shameful sense, not a concealment of anything wrong or dishonest or unworthy. It was simply the thing that her mother had chosen not to speak of, and the reasons for that silence were her mother's own, were made of whatever the particular texture of that particular love had been, whatever weight it had held, and gone on holding through all the years of her mother's life without ever quite becoming lighter. For the one who will understand why I kept this, Elara understood. She understood because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother's daughter was someone who kept things, who kept old letters not to read them, but to hold the keeping of them, who kept the prayer books of grandmothers and the christening gowns of the unmemorable and the bone-handled knives that she would never use, and the half-finished embroidery with the needle still threaded, as though the keeping itself were the point, as though the act of holding something in existence were a form of faithfulness to the thing and to the person who had once held it first. She understood, because the photograph was not a record of something shameful, but a record of something real. A moment in a garden, in summer, with a person who had mattered, a moment that her mother had taken with her through all the years of her life, and had kept and had returned to, perhaps, in the way that one returns to such things. Not with longing, or not, but with a kind of gratitude for having lived a life that contained such a moment, for having stood once in a summer garden with a person whose hand was reaching for hers, for having been young and alive, and at the beginning of things that could not have been known to be either the beginning of forever or the beginning of a kept secret. The man in the photograph held his story in the angle of his half-turned face, and the story would not be known because the story was not hers to know. This was as it should be. The photograph had not been left for her to solve, but to keep. The trunks held their old silences. She sat for a long time in the pale winter light, with the photograph in her hands, and the attic was quiet around her, and the dust motes drifted in the still light, and somewhere outside a bird called once and did not call again. The cold of the attic had settled into her bones now, in the way that cold does when you have been still long enough, and she was aware of it as a kind of companionship, the cold and the quiet and the drifting light keeping her company in the way that old houses keep company, not warmly, not with words, but with a presence that is no less real for being made of stone and timber and the accumulated patience of years. She thought about the note for the one who will understand why I kept this. Her mother had written it knowing or trusting that someone would find it, that the trunk would eventually be opened, that the layers of linen and lavender would eventually be lifted. She had written it for the finding. She had chosen not to name the finder, not to address it to my daughter or to Elara, had left it simply and generously open. For the one, as though she could not know which of her daughters it might be, or as though the understanding were the qualification, not the name. But Elara was the one. She had been the one for some time now, had been the last of her line, the last woman in the house, the keeper of the kept things. She was the one because she was all that was left, and the note had waited for her, and now she had come, and she had read it, and she understood. The house breathed its patient breath. She took the photograph and the folded note, and she held them together for a moment, looking one last time at the young woman in the garden, at the composure that was not quite suppressing what was underneath it, at the hand of the man who was half turning away or toward, who held in his turned face a story that would remain exactly what it was, private, complete beyond her reach, and rightly so. Her mother looked back at her from the sepia distance of 70 years, with those familiar eyes, her mother's eyes, and for a moment Elara felt the particular vertigo of recognizing in another person's young face the echo of one's own, the sense of looking at what one might have looked like, at what one perhaps did look like, in that summer of being young and at a garden gate, with a person. She got to her feet carefully, taking her time, letting her knees accept the change of position at the rate they required. She picked up her canvas bag. She put the photograph and the folded note into her cardigan pocket, the same pocket where the small brass key had been, and she felt them there against her side light, insubstantial, the weight of a secret that had already been kept for decades and would now simply be kept differently by different hands. She spent a little while longer in the attic, not sorting, just present, standing in the pale winter light, with the trunks around her and the dust motes drifting, in the still air, letting the task of the afternoon settle into something completed, or something begun, or something that was both at once. She would come back. There were boxes she had not opened, trunks she had not unlocked. The attic had more to give, and she had time. though she knew better than most how time arranges itself. She would come back on another afternoon, with her canvas bag and her steadier heart, and she would continue the slow, patient work of sorting through the things that generations leave behind. But for today, this was enough. For today, she had been given what she had been sent to find. Though she had not, the cedar box kept its fragrance. She descended the attic stairs slowly, one hand on the wall for steadiness, the boards creaking softly beneath her feet in their familiar way. The sound she had heard all her life, the specific language of these stairs. The second step from the top, with its high note, the fifth from the bottom, with its lower, more resonant complaint, the landing at the bottom that settled under her weight with a sound like a long exhalation. The house was warm below the attic, the heat of it rising to meet her as she came down, and she stood for a moment on the landing and felt the warmth fold around her and was grateful for it. She went to her bedroom, her own bedroom, which had been her bedroom her whole life, the room where she had slept as a girl and a young woman and a middle-aged woman, and now an old one. The room with the window that faced the garden and the dresser with the oval mirror and the small cedar box that sat on the dresser's top beside her mother's wedding ring and her father's pocket watch. The cedar box had been her mother's. It had sat in this room, on this dresser, for as long as Elara could remember, and the smell of it, cedar and something older, something that lived inside the cedar, some deeper note of time and resin and the wood's own slow breath, was one of the first smells she could recall from her earliest life, a smell that meant this room, meant the small box of kept things. She opened the cedar box now and looked at what was already inside it. Her mother's wedding ring, plain gold, worn thin on one side from 60 years of wearing. Her father's pocket watch, silver, with a monogram on the case, his father's initials, not his own, passed down, a small lock of hair coiled inside a twist of tissue paper that she had put there years ago and whose origin she had lost, which she thought might be her own hair from a first cutting, though she was not certain. A dried flower, unidentifiable now, pressed flat to the colour of old straw. The official story, the kept things of a life that had been lived in the open, in the daylight, in the company of the world and its knowledge. She took the photograph from her pocket, and she placed it in the cedar box, face up. Then she took the folded note, and she tucked it beneath the photograph, so that both lay together at the bottom of the box, beneath the wedding ring, beneath the pocket watch, beneath the lock of hair and the pressed flower. The secret story beneath the official one, which was perhaps how it had always been, how it always is, the visible life resting on the invisible one, like the surface of a river resting on its depth. She looked at the photograph one last time before she closed the lid. Her mother's young face, the familiar eyes, the composure that contained what composure cannot entirely contain, the man half turning, his hand reaching, the space between his hand and hers vibrating with its old particular weight, the summer garden behind them, roses or some other full flower blurring into soft abundance. The cedar kept its fragrance, and the box kept its peace, and the photograph was where it was meant to be, not hidden any more, not buried beneath decades of linens and lavender, but held, kept placed alongside the things that were kept openly, treated with the same care as the wedding ring and the pocket watch, given its proper place in the small cedar world of the kept things. She would not speak of it. She had understood the note, and she had accepted it, and the acceptance meant the keeping, and the keeping meant the silence, not the silence of shame, not the silence of concealment, but the silence of a person who has been entrusted with something that belongs to someone else's story, and who knows that the right way to hold it is quietly, carefully, with both hands. The house breathed its patient breath. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and stood at the window while she waited for it to boil. The garden was winter. Bare, the beds cut back, the roses tied in their canes, the gate at the far end standing closed in the fading afternoon light. The light was almost gone now. The pale winter afternoon had been brief, and was briefer still by the time she had descended from the attic and done what she had done. And